Hey, this is Ask the Pastor. The internet sends me questions, and I make videos for the internet and send them out. This is a ministry that I'm doing as a part of my church, College Park Presbyterian Church. And what we're trying to do is find ways to reach beyond our walls, to show our love and engage people who might not otherwise be touched by us in this time when we're not able to meet together in person. I want to read this question that was sent to me. Back in biblical times, marriage was often a transaction between families. Now we have marriage licenses, documents, etc. What constitutes a marriage in the eyes of God, and how does it differ from what our culture recognizes as marriage? Whew. All right, there's a lot to that question. Let's talk about it kind of piece by piece. So that I can make sure to do justice to every part of it. The first statement is, back in biblical times, marriage was often a transaction between families. All right, so I got to take my first little tangent here because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. All right, when somebody says back in biblical times, I start getting worried. Because here's the thing, like Leviticus, Job, these would have been written sometime around 2500 BC. The oldest texts and documents and oral histories we have maybe go even back farther than that before they're compiled into texts and then made a part of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. And then we've got stories that come from like before the Babylonian exile. And then we've got all the way to Malachi that happens 100 years after the return from Babylonian exile. And then we go another 200 years. And then we've got the New Testament that takes place in the first century. But we've got stories that take place like at the birth of Jesus. And then we've got stories that take place in like Revelation, which is probably around the year 90-ish, right? That take place at the end of the first century. And if you look at like what has happened in the last 2,500 years, 2,600 years, that's a lot of times. Like there are a lot of eras. So like Bible times is not like the Wild West. You know, the Wild West lasted maybe 30 years. Bible times is millennia long. There's all sorts of different Bible times, and these books are all written at different times in history. The New Testament is written in a global empire that had democracy and running water. And in the earliest parts of the Old Testament were like built while people were still figuring out how tents work. And so they're just very different times from each other. But it is true that even like up to the Middle Ages, marriage was not seen in the same way marriage is seen in our times. Our times where we have this focus on romantic love and this idea that someone is going to be your soulmate and you're going to feel butterflies for them all the time, that's really kind of new and actually really kind of strange. Some would argue it's not a good thing. It's not, you know, if you talk to a marriage counselor, there's some ways we need to untangle the number of romantic comedies we've seen in terms of our expectation for what marriage is really like. But I also don't want to go back to this transaction situation where it's like, my family's wealthy, your family's wealthy, so let's get married. Or like, my family's poor, but you seem strong enough to pull a plow, so let's get married. That's not really what I'm looking for either. And the biblical prescriptions, the biblical instructions about marriage have endured through all those changes. So what gives? Now I'm going to read the next part of here. It says, now we have marriage licenses, documents, etc. Actually, they had those then too. Again, depending on where then we're talking about. But in the law of Moses, there was a understanding of giving someone a certificate of divorce. And you can read in Ruth, there was a big moment about giving of a sandal. And if you exchange a sandal, then that makes the deal official. And it's a big deal that in Ruth the sandal was exchanged because that had to do with the kingly line of King David. And we had to make sure that Ruth the Moabite was officially recognized and the sandal was really given. And so there are ways in which in the different times of the Bible, those documents had happened and existed. And then the final question is, what constitutes a marriage in the eyes of God? And how does it differ from what our culture recognizes as marriage? And this is the heart of the question. Because it's true, like our culture has a thing and is like really interested right now, in particular, with what the U.S. federal government recognizes as a marriage. There's this belief that if the U.S. federal government says something is a marriage, or says someone is married, or says someone is divorced, then that forces God to do something different. Right? Then like that God is tied up and accountable to the U.S. federal government. And that's strange. And I think even the people that believe that, like they don't form those words in their head because intuitively they know that makes no sense, right? That like somehow if the president and Congress and the Supreme Court do something that ruins something that God does, that's not true. And certainly there have been people, even before same-sex marriage and those kinds of debates and restrictions, that have had farces of marriages, right? That have filed for documents that are just not what God calls married. So what does God call married? Well, answers depend on your Christian tradition. There are different people that say it differently. In our Book of Order, in the Presbyterian Church USA, our current language says that marriage is a sacred bond between two people, traditionally a man and a woman. And that is an opportunity for them to covenant with each other and to promise to be together, to be partners in life. And the state often corresponds to it, but the marriage that is a covenant between these people and God is different from the marriage that the state institutes or regulates or understands. So there are some interesting situations even right now during COVID where there are going to be some people who are going to get their marriage license and be married in the eyes of the state, but then have a wedding in a different place or a different time to be married in the eyes of God, or to be married before the church. And sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes people want to be married in the church or married in the eyes of God, and they don't want to be married in the eyes of the state because they're against it or they're protesting it for some reason. There are some tax advantages to being married in the eyes of the state, so usually it goes the other way around, but it happens. Now there's a third reality, which is that sometimes people don't want to be married. They don't mean to be married, but they are. That God recognizes, hey, you really ought to be faithful to this person. You really ought to be committed to this person. And your refusal to commit, it's not good. It's not okay. In the ancient Near East, if you have sex with someone, particularly if you're a male and it is found out that you have had sexual relations with a woman, the understanding is, well, that's your wife, right? Because that's what you call the person that you've had sex with. You call them your wife or you call them your husband. When Jesus speaks to the woman at the well, he says, "Where's your husband?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know." And he says, "You've had 7 husbands, and the one you're with now isn't even your husband." The assumption is not this person has filed for marriage licenses 7 times. The assumption is this person has been sleeping around. They've been serially monogamous is one of the words for it. And that's a problem because that forms a bond that then rips and another bond that then rips. And so I'm not ready to speak and to say, that this is God's standard, but that was a standard that was used and that was well understood throughout the ancient Near East. And I still think there are situations today when there are relationships that you look at them and you're like, that's a marriage. You know, they don't want to call it that. They're not using labels. Well, okay. The answer to your question then is kind of vague. The final answer to your question is, what God calls a marriage, it's not what the state calls a marriage. It's not necessarily even what the church calls a marriage. It is a marriage, is what God calls a marriage. And in order to understand what every instance of a marriage in God's eyes are, you'd have to be God. And you'd have to ask God which ones he considers. But for those of us that are trying to live in the holiest way we can and make the best decisions about our marriage covenants, I would recommend that you get married, preferably before the church, and that you make a commitment in public, that you say to all of your friends and all of their friends, hey, I promise to be faithful to this person forever, and then you go ahead and you get the tax advantages too. That is the best way to do it as far as I'm concerned. And so if I've answered your question, I hope you share it and tell people that I've answered your question. If I haven't, or if you have more clarifying questions, you can talk to me about them. And if you've got your own question, you should send it in. Meanwhile, you might like these other videos I made. Thank you very much.